How's that? Can you hear me? Okay, great. Well, thank you for coming to the Wayland Library on this rainy afternoon. I think you're in for a treat, and I want to thank the Historical Commission for holding their event here. Please help yourself to food out in the hallway. And just so you know, we are filming this for Waycam. So if you don't want the back of your head on camera, I encourage you to move to the back of the room. And with that, I'd like to introduce Kay Westcott, who's the chair of the Historical Commission.
Don't worry, I'm very brief. But I do want, if all the people on the Historical Commission that are here would just stand up for a minute so you could be recognized. These are the people that are saving the history for Weyland. But we're here because I have the privilege of introducing a very special member who is Tonya Largy. Many of you already know Tonya because she's been here saving our history for some time. But in case you don't know Tonya's background, let me tell you that she has a degree in anthropology from the University of Boston, a master's degree in anthropology also from the University of Boston Amherst, and MSW from Fordham University in New York. Tonya is an archaeological consultant specializing in the analysis of plant and animal remains from archaeological sites in New England, New York, and Pennsylvania. She is also associated with the Zooarchaeology Laboratory at the Peabody Museum at Harvard University. Tonya has been active in local archaeology since 1970 and is the co-founder an arm of the Wayland Historical Commission, of which she is a member. Tonya has been involved in numerous excavations in the Sudbury, Assavet, Concord River Basin since that time. She also has an extensive field experience in the broader Northeast with the National Park Service. As a staff member of the Zooarchaeology Lab at Harvard, Tonya has also worked in the ancient site of, whoa, you didn't tell me how to pronounce that one, Appa in Pakistan. I hope you will all welcome Tonya as she comes to tell you her history.
Thank you, Kay, very much. Thank you all for coming on such a rainy, not very nice day, and I appreciate it, especially those who came from a big distance. This is a reproduction of a mansion in Point, which we'll talk about more later. This is Archaeology Month, which is winding up. October, the whole month, has had in different places speakers and activities that have to do with archaeology. I decided to give this talk about Dena Dincauze, and the catalyst for that is when the Massachusetts Historical Commission sent the letter to the commissions and organizations in Massachusetts to think about events for Archaeology Month, and one of their suggestions was, since the women got the right to vote 100 years ago, that it might be a good time to remember the work of a woman archaeologist or an archaeological site that interprets and explains a woman from the past. So, since I studied with Dena, I decided, this is the year to talk about her. She passed away in, not 1016. I just noticed that's a typo, 2016. And a lot of people miss her and miss her advice. She was, when she died, Professor Emerita in the Department of Anthropology at UMass Amherst, where I did my master's degree. She was a teacher, an advisor, a mentor, a role model, and the source of support to many students and professionals. And she embraced you as a person and worked very closely with you. And those of us who studied with her certainly miss her. I asked some of my colleagues, local and a few distant, for their remembrances of Dena. And one of them is with us today, Shirley Blanca from Concord. She's associated with the Concord Museum. So she sent me something, and I'm going to read it. I already forewarned her about that. Dena had studied a year at Cambridge University in England while Shirley was a student. My main memory of her is of, this is Shirley speaking, my main memory of her is of seeing her in the Cambridge University Anthropology Library in 1956 and 57, when she was a graduate student and I an undergraduate. I admired her beautiful blonde hair, but didn't get to know her until years later over here in this country. During that time at the university, Glenn Daniel, a well-known archaeology professor and TV personality in Britain, took us students on a wonderful bus tour of the major archaeological sites in southern England that I will never forget. I always wondered why Dena wasn't there. Years later, when I asked her about it, she said she was much too much of a bookworm and thought she shouldn't take the time off from studying, but she had regretted ever since missing that tour. She did also give Shirley advice about what sites here in this area she thought worth pursuing. Shirley earned her doctorate at Boston University in anthropology, and she's been active in archaeological work for many, many years, too. And in particular, Dena suggested the Concord shell midden that resulted years later in the Clamshell Bluff report. That got Shirley started in the direction of trying to complete research and reports that were left hanging in some way, such as the Davis Farm site in Sudbury. And I want to tell you, Shirley did a wonderful job on both of those. So, and thank you for being here today, Shirley. I have one more, and I'll read that one at the end. The other two, I'm afraid I'm going to go over the time anyway. Now, why was Weyland such a rich area for Native people to come here to live, to hunt, and collect plant and animal resources? Well, where's my map here? No, go back, I skipped one. This is a map of Weyland showing the major water resources. This is the Sudbury River, Hurd Pond, Dudley Pond, and Lake Cochituate. This is very rich in kettle hole ponds and rivers that had resources, and Native people who lived a hunting and gathering way of life, they collected those resources. That's how they lived. They got their clothing, their housing, their food, raw material for their implements, and they couldn't have lived without the natural world around them. So the Sudbury River meadows were especially important to them. The Native American name for that is the musketaquid, or grassy ground. And it offered a lot of advantages because of that. It was transportation, a transportation route by canoe and footpaths along the streams. There was the availability of fish and game. They collected, as Shirley and I found out at the Concord Shell Heap, Clamshell Bluff, that I mentioned before, that she did a lot of work on. I identified the animal bones, and we found a lot of beaver and muskrats. So those are what we call obligate wetland species. And so they collected those. There were some deer represented, and there was one snake vertebrae, and one fish bone. But the problem was that a lot of people had collected there. Thoreau collected there back in the 1800s. Lots of people knew that was a site. And the bones that we got to look at were just a sample. Turtles were very important there, too, especially the Plymouth red-bellied turtle. And when a herpetology friend of mine did the analysis on the turtle bones, and that provided a range extension because they are presently limited to the ponds around Plymouth, Massachusetts, and people never knew that they had extended further away. So that was a really important find, even though it was a disturbed site and just a sample of what probably was there thousands of years ago. That site was 4,000 years old. It was defensible, the Sudbury River was, because they could see people coming. They trapped the riverine mammals that I mentioned. They used the wetland plants for food, medicine, baskets, and mats. And there were nearby stone sources for tools. There were countless Indian trails going through this area. Howard Russell published a book in 1980, Indian New England Before the Mayflower, and he compiled, and he said this was an incomplete list of recorded Indian trails and villages in southern New England at the beginning of the 17th century. So the Old Connecticut Path was one of these, and I'm not exactly sure where it diverges. I think this is the Old Connecticut Path that goes down into Connecticut. And the Old Connecticut Path actually runs right by the Mansion Inn site. The Mansion Inn site was located at the corner of West Plain Street and Route 126, where the split-level housing development is now. There's a seat up here, Tim. Okay. This is my son, my number 2 son. How many of you were around to see the Mansion Inn when it was still standing? Okay. Okay, one person was. That's great. So you can attest to what a beautiful place it must have been. Oh, yes, I bet you did. Okay, I have pictures of that. The Mansion Inn was well known. Now, Paul Kohler worked at the Mansion Inn as a young man. And in an oral history to the high school, these pictures, a lot of them are from the high school history project. He told them the Mansion Inn was well known among the drinking population. When Bostonians and Newtonites wanted to get away, they would come to Cochituate to dine and dance at the Mansion Inn. And that's where he worked, and he remembered that very clearly. This was the fancy covered entrance to the Mansion Inn. It certainly was an impressive building. It had 4 stone lions around it, and there were 4 of them, but we only know where 3 of them are now. One is in the side yard of the Herd House Museum. One is on private property in Wayland, and one is at the John C. Bryant Funeral Home. They recently found it and brought it home. The 4th one, we don't know where that is at this time, and some people told me possibly it's in Waltham, but we don't know that for sure. There is the wonderful lion at Bryant's Funeral Home. That's a very majestic animal. This is the one on private property. And notice that his nose is missing. Mansion Inn on fire. Is this what you remember? Yes. Yes. Okay. This was a before picture when it started, and that's when it was fully engulfed. This is what it looked like after the fire. I guess a great deal of the roof and the upper stories were gone, and probably a lot of the downstairs. And I understand it may have started in the kitchen because it was a restaurant at that time. This was in March of 1956. Again, this is from the high school history project. This is West Plain Street. This is Old Connecticut Path, aka Route 126. This is where the split-level housing development is now. And after everything was settled, I'm imagining that there was insurance claims and such. But in June of 1959, this was 3 years after it burned, an Indian cremation cemetery was discovered on the site as earth-moving equipment began to prep the ground for a housing development. There was a mound there, and this had been brought down quite a bit to make the land levels for the housing development. This site overlooks Dudley Pond, and it drops off precipitously, and Lakeshore Drive runs at the bottom of the knoll. So there's really nothing to see there anymore. Here's some facts about it. It was a cremation burial site. It was dated, thanks to Dena's work, for the transitional late archaic period, which was about 3,500 years ago. BP stands for before present, which means years ago. And that's before 1950, because that is when radiocarbon dating was developed in 1950. So it's getting older by the minute. It was discovered by avocational archaeologists, one of who lived in Weyland, J. Alfred Mansfield, known as Al, his life. And this was before the Native American Graves Protection and Restoration Act. And nowadays this would never happen. But they started to excavate it according to the standards of their day. They were members of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. And the neighbors found out about it, and the avocational people soon lost the site to the neighbors. So the graves were dug in a very non-scientific fashion by the local residents. Later on, when the R.S. Peabody Museum found out about it, Dr. Fred Johnson, who was an archaeologist there, came down, and he got the developer to put a fence around it to protect it. And then he carried out a proper excavation, again according to the standards of the early 1960s, late 50s. However, he did a good job, and we did get some information. And then Dena Dincauze, who was a graduate student at Harvard University in the Department of Anthropology, she studied it as part of her doctoral dissertation research. She wrote this book, Cremation Cemeteries of Eastern Massachusetts, not just Mansion Inn, but several other sites were in there. She studied the artifacts. Al Mansfield, when he was still with us, told me that Dena spent many hours in his basement because he had, even though he couldn't continue with the excavation, he had actually recovered a lot of material. And he published a paper, which you'll see about in a minute. So he welcomed her to come and study his artifacts, and that's what she did. She also found out about a site, the Vincent Site in Sudbury, and the Watertown Arsenal was on a site that was probably a cremation cemetery. It was very disturbed. We'll talk about that in a minute. And the Coburn site was in East Orleans on the Cape. And David DeMillo was the director of the Robbins Museum, and he drove here to hear my talk, and he provided me with one of the very old publications, which I was able to use in the talk. So thank you, David. All right, cremation burial sites. Mansion Inn, I told you already, overlooked Dudley Pond near Old Connecticut Path. The Vincent Site was composed of a single cremation burial, which was found on private land on Dudley Road in Sudbury when Paul Vincent, who lived there, was leveling the backyard for a lawn. Now, I have to thank Royce Kohler, who's here, who's a longtime member of the Wayland Archaeology group, because he drew my attention to the story of how Dena got involved. And it's really an interesting story. Now, let me just see my notes so that I don't get it backwards. Let's see, okay. What happened is one of the neighbors named Ed Kreitzek lived a few doors away from the Vincents. And he happened to tell Dr. Hallam Movius, who lived in Sudbury and was a professor at Harvard, about this find that the Vincents had told him about. So Dr. Movius told Stephen Williams, who was also a professor in the anthropology department, who specialized in American archaeology. Dr. Movius more specialized in Europe and Asia, and he's a very well-known person, and he's not with us anymore either. But Stephen Williams told Dena that he wanted her to go and check it out. So that's how she got to come. And it's really interesting because it wasn't in Dena's book when she described the situation, but Royce told me that he was told that Dr. Movius said, "I'm going to send the best archaeologist in New England to check out this site." The Watertown Arsenal is on the Charles River on the southern shore, and it was found with roads and sidewalks were being built. Not demonstrably graves, Dena said, although the nation and condition of the contents and of the charcoal blackened fill are perfectly comparable to unquestionable secondarily deposited cremation remains at other sites. Pardon me? Oh, the Coburn. I skipped Coburn. Thank you. 4 cremation burials and many artifacts were found in soils disturbed by road building and later excavated by a member of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society with his son. The article was published in 1961 by the man who discovered the site. If you Googled Coburn site, the article from the MAS Bulletin, Mass Archaeological Society Bulletin, will come up, and you can read about it. This is what the backyard of the Vincent Site feature looked like. Oops, wrong button. This was some of the blackened fill. There were bones, and there were small burned bones and very small pieces of stone tools and some larger stone tools in there. And these are all discussed in Dena's book. I have to tell you, the book is out of print, and there may be very few of them, the cremation cemeteries in eastern Massachusetts, available online, but you will pay quite a bit to get them. But they should be available through interlibrary loan if you want to read the whole depth. I'm just scratching the surface of what's in that book. The radiocarbon date that they were able to get from this burial feature was 3,470 years, plus or minus 125 years before 1950. So this cremation burial tradition was called the Susquehanna tradition, and it centered around 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. This is a map of the excavation units at Mansion Inn. Here is you can see from the gradient that this was a very steep slope. This is Old Connecticut Path. This is West Plain Street. If you take this little square and telescope it out, then you see where the excavation units were. So they were clustered together. So it's very obvious that this was an intentional burial ground. And none of them seem to overlap. When Dr. Johnson came down from the Peabody Museum in Andover, this is the snow fence I told you he was able to get the police or the developer to put up. He started doing an excavation, and this he called Locus 5, and these appear to be the features. And you can see that they're very different from the soil around them. The Mansion Inn provided really new information about what artifacts from that time period were like. And in Dena's book, someone had drawn these types. They're stylized, Mansion Inn points. This is the one that jumps right out at you, and this is a smaller version of it. When you see these that have been recovered from other sites, these are idealized Mansion Inn blades. These are idealized Weyland notched points. Both types are represented in various burial features. Maybe not all of them from one feature. These are from Al Mansfield's bulletin article. Now, the convention is, at the present time, that archaeologists do not show actual artifacts from burial features because this is very offensive to Native people. Illustrations are okay, so that's why I feel all right showing these to you. So these are some of the tool types from Mansion Inn. Keep your eye on this one. It's going to come up later. These are the Mansion Inn points. This the one that I said kind of jumps out at you when you see them. Many years ago in the 80s, the National Park Service sent me to the Saugus Iron Works to help the curator have a name to put down for the Indian artifacts because he didn't know anything about them. So we asked the Park Service to help, and they sent me. So he and I sat there for 3 days, and I would pick one up and say what I thought it was and what the material was, and he would write it down. So I hope they got somebody with more experience since then. But I was pretty good back then. I knew my artifacts. And there were Mansion Inn points in that collection, and I told him that. The Saugus Iron Works was at a falls on the Saugus River, and it was a big site. Besides the earliest iron works in the New World, it was also an extensive Indian site Roland Wells Robbins was the archaeologist who excavated that. He found the artifacts on the way to trying to find the remnants, the buried remnants of the iron mill, so that they could restore it. And that is a wonderful, wonderful historic site if you've never been there. I went there a few years ago just as a tourist, and I was most impressed with what I saw. But why I think that was so important for Native people is the Saugus River comes in there, and then there are the falls, which fish could get over, but they have to pool up at the base of the falls, which then allowed Native people to collect them with dip nets. They'd stand on the rocks and with these long-handled nets, and they could scoop up the fish. So that was an important place. Any place with a waterfall, it would have been very similar. In the Neponset River, the alewives run up the Neponset River to a waterfall it's a dam now in Middleborough, down the hill from the Robbins Museum. And it's just amazing that the state built a fish ladder, and in April, the herring start running up the river. And it's really impressive to see all of those herring coming up the river, swimming around, taking their turn to try to go up the fish ladder. If you've never done that, that would be an interesting thing to do. Local distribution of Mantuan blades. According to Dena's book, it's expanded since then. Susquehanna tradition includes Mansion Inn blades, Weyland notched points, which I showed you, and another type called boats blades from the boat site along the Taunton River. Mansion Inn blades have also been found along the Taunton and the Merrimack in Litchfield, New Hampshire. Along the Concord River, of which Sudbury's the major tributary, Mansion Inn blades have been found in Concord and Burlington, and Wayland notched points in Billerica, and they're all in private collections. Unpublished collections from Connecticut include Mansion Inn and Wayland notched implement blades. The Saugus Ironworks I already told you about, and so there are some in the collection there too. Shirley, has any turned up in anything in Ben Smith's collection in the Concord Museum?
I'm not sure about his, but some of the older material that came from the museum has some, yes.
Okay. So that's not too surprising. Now, there was one singular tool from Mansion Inn that not a lot of people talk about, and that's a copper adze. It was found at Locus 6 in a burial feature, and no other copper artifacts were found. It's the only one. And it was curated at the Robbins Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology in Middleborough. All of that is going to be repatriated according to the NAGPRA law. So that will go back in the ground someday. A woman named Mary Ann Levine, who was a PhD graduate at UMass Amherst. Can't remember if Dena was her advisor or not. I suspect Dena had a lot of advice to give her, though, because she had always been disappointed that back when she wrote her book, no one had been able to source the copper that the axe was made from, or the adze was made from. Now, Mary Ann collected samples from quite a few native copper sources with the help of geologists and museums and such in the Northeast. And they ran studies on them. It was a very complicated geochemical analytical process. And I tried reading her paper, is in Journal of Archaeological Science, and It's really hard to follow if you're not a geochemist. But that process provided data that the most probable origin of the Mansion Inn copper adze was a Lake Superior source. Michipicoten Island in Ontario, Canada. And I'll show you the table where it is number 14 in a minute. Michipicoten is the second largest island in Lake Superior. Okay.
Excuse me. How large is this adze?
I looked at it once because when I was a student out there, and I had some knowledge of wood anatomy, there was a piece of charcoal that was stuck to the adze. It had cemented itself to the adze. Marianne asked me if I would look at it and see if I could give her any ideas what kind of wood. So she brought it to me one day, and we had a microscope set up, and I looked at it. And I said to her, well, it's a hardwood, but it was a longitudinal piece and not a cross-section, and that's where it's easiest to get some idea what kind of wood it is, looking first at the cross-section. And I told her I couldn't do it without having a look at the cross-section. I said, why don't you go to Dr. Hoadley in the wood technology department? Maybe he can tell you. So she went, and he told her the same thing that I did. So there was no plan to take that wood off and look at it in another facet of it, the transverse section. So I don't know if anybody ever figured that out.
My question was, how big is this adze?
Well, I don't know. It was about this big. I didn't measure it, and I didn't see it. In 1993 or 4, I saw it. A long time ago. It was a respectable size. It wasn't tiny, and it wasn't huge. And adze, they call it an adze. That's a woodworking tool. These are the defined geological sources of native copper in the Northeast from her paper. 2007, if anybody wants to look it up. There is, I've been practicing how to say that word, island, right there. And there were 36 samples from that source, and all of what they call hits on the analytical trace elements lined up for this site for that tool. This is an aerial view of just one part of Michipicoten Island, and it really looks like a beautiful spot. It's in the northeastern part of Lake Superior, 11 miles long, 10 miles from the Ontario mainland. So they would have had to get there by boat, I would think. It's the second largest island in Lake Superior. And it probably had other resources there too. And that is my acknowledgement. Now what I want to do is end with a very lovely tribute from Joyce Clements, who is a consulting archaeologist. She said, I was never formally introduced to Dena Dincauze, but like many archaeologists, I saw her as one of the founders of New England archaeological theory. No cultural resource management report was complete without citations to her early synthesis of cremation sites in the Boston Basin, New England archaic period cultures, or New World Paleo-Indian marshalling camps, and she wrote about all of those things. Dincauze and Mulholland, which was another graduate student, had a big paper about that. Among those of us in cultural resource management, Dena Dincauze inspired a kind of awe and even envy for those who had studied with her. Thus it was with some trepidation that I cautiously approached her in 1998 prior to conducting research on a site she had salvaged as a doctoral candidate nearly 30 years earlier. 30 years is a long time, and salvage archaeology requires greater speed and fewer restrictions than academic archaeology. What would Dena remember about the site, and what could she reasonably be expected to share? I anticipated waiting a long time for a reply to my request for unpublished field notes, photographs, or personal recollections of the site. I even allowed the possibility that Dena might not reply at all. My name would have been unknown to her, and my request one among numerous communications she must have received daily. I was therefore quite surprised when the professor answered my request quickly and thoroughly. She provided me with artifact photographs and slides and described the circumstances under which her salvage excavations had been conducted. Her communications to me were professionally encouraging and left me with the memory of a warm and supportive encounter. I wish I had personally known Dena Dincauze or had the privilege of studying with her, but I'm grateful that our paths crossed professionally. New England prehistory is indebted to her brilliant mind, and academics and archaeologists are richer for her exemplary leadership. So I'd like to end there, and if you have any questions, I would be happy to try to answer them. And as I said, I just scratched the surface. And before any questions, we really have a very, very rich resource of Native American habitation sites. Some of them have been gone. There are houses and other things on top of them. But we have a very, very rich community with those sorts of things. The Historical Commission has been trying for many years to record those places and to protect them when possible. And if there is a good reason for, this is only on public land, we don't have jurisdiction over private property unless someone invites us to come in and look at something. But we try very hard. Well, we do make sure that any construction on public lands are subjected to archaeological survey, and that's very important. So with that, if there are any questions, please talk loudly because I can't hear very well. I might need somebody to repeat the question.
Yeah, I'm very interested to hear about the use of copper. Were there other metals that were used, and how much was copper used, and what was it used for?
Well, there wasn't any other copper that I'm aware of until the English came with their iron pots.
I see.
And in the trading that went back and forth with native people, they traded for the pots, and then they cut, and other iron implements, and they cut them up to make points out of them. So iron points do turn up. Shirley.
And brass points too.
And what?
Brass
Points. Okay, well, there must have been brass kettles too.
Yes.
Shirley may know more about that than I do. I know more about the seeds and the bones. Tim?
The burials were 3,500 years old. Was the copper adze, what did you call it?
And adze.
That presumed to be 3,500 years old?
Everything in the burials, yeah, because the radiocarbon dates came out of the features. There were probably some years a little different. You know, I'm sure all the burials didn't happen at the same time when someone died. There's a whole thing about maybe these are secondary burials too, because people might have had to bury their loved ones in one place, And then at the gathering times in the spring and in the fall, when people gathered together, they may have brought the bones of the deceased and burned them and buried them. There was supposedly a crematorium there, but I didn't see anything in Dena's book about that. So I don't know.
I'm
David?
going to mention to Tim, we have a copper axe at our museum in Middleborough. That one is dated to 3,000 to 4,000 years old, and it was found in Kingston, just north of Plymouth.
And it was iron?
And it was copper.
A copper,
Yeah.
okay.
And it was said in the article that was written up in the bulletin that there were only 5 or 6 of them ever found in New England.
I tried to find that article, and I didn't get to find it, and I ran out of time to ask you to find it. I ran out of time. There's a question in the back.
Just a remark, there is a well-known old copper culture up in Wisconsin, on the east side of the
You know, I'm sorry, I'm not hearing everything.
I was just mentioning, there is a well-known old copper culture on the
Yes.
eastern side of Wisconsin.
Yes, I've heard about that.
And their artifacts are on spread at this time over a large area of the United States.
Anyone ever studied where they came from? Done all the work that Mary Ann Levine did?
I do not know.
There may be something in the literature about that, in the archaeological literature. Dick?
I think we're all fascinated with that copper axe. Was that maybe 8 inches
I don't
with
think
axe blade or with a handle also?
there was no handle there.
Just a
It
blade.
would have deteriorated or burned if it because it might have been burned.
For those who don't know, an axe is like a hand axe. The blade is not parallel to the handle, it's across. So it's perfect for hollowing out a wooden bowl
Yes.
or a dugout canoe, things of that sort.
Well, they used gouges like that too.
Now, was it metallic copper that had been cast?
It was in the ground for so many years, and I don't know how they formed it. Mary Ann didn't write about that. David?
The article on the blade that we got from Kingston, they said that the copper, it was from Lake Superior. They were definitely able to place it. And they said the copper up there is so pure, you don't need to smelt it. You just take the copper and hot or cold hammer it as need be to create whatever shape you wish.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. That's a good thing.
A question about cremation.
Yes.
Was this common cremation? Are there many other burial sites that are not cremated remains? And why did they use cremation?
Well, that is a good question. The Susquehanna tradition seems to have followed cremation burials and incorporated those with tools. We don't know if that tool had ever been used. Sometimes they made tools to put, just made them new and put them in with the burial. About the tool, the bones, if they're not burned, they do not last. We have such acidic soil in New England that everything that is not burned will deteriorate and disappear, except if it's in a shell heap or submerged in water constantly, like a swamp, or if it's in a dry cave, such as in the Southwest. Otherwise, organic material, and that goes for plant remains too, seeds and nut shells and wood, it would just all rot away over time. And that's because we have such acidic soil. But the cremation burials, well, that's become back in fashion now, right? That's what is happening in today. Many people choose cremation. And though the fire has to be about 900 degrees, And a physical anthropologist from Connecticut, who was the state archaeologist there, said that sometimes it appears that someone had stirred the embers so that the pieces would burn to smaller pieces. Now, Dena did have a part in her book about the skeletal material, and there were both human and animal remains that were recognized. But the human remains, they were parts of bone mostly from the cranium, from the head, and also I think I read about one vertebral centrum apart from the vertebra, but they were pretty reduced in size. You need a physical anthropologist to tell you what those pieces are. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Because I thought cremation was fairly rare in ancient cultures.
Not in the late archaic period here
Okay.
in this country, in the Northeast anyway.
Do we know much about the people who lived in this
That's
area?
a really good question. That's what anthropologists are supposed to try to figure out, right? They must have been very loving people because their ancestors were treated with a great deal of respect, and they cared about where they were going to go. Dena, in her book, felt that that corner of West Plain Street and Old Connecticut Path overlooking Dudley Pond, she felt it was an isolated place, and that's why they brought the people, the bones there, the cremations, however they brought them there, to be buried. Now, we know that that's not terribly isolated, but it ran right by the Old Connecticut Path, which was an ancient trail that the Indians used. So it was probably known as a burial ground, and so it wasn't very isolated. Even maybe 3,500 years ago it might have been. But it's just hard to know. But the people must have cared very much. You have to look at the habitation sites to try to figure out what the lifeways were like. One of my work is looking at plant materials, and they're always burned, little seeds that are 1 millimeter in size, trying to figure out what they are. The wood that's always has to be carbonized, bones of animals that are burned, because you wouldn't have them otherwise.
And were habitation sites near this cremation place?
There probably were, and maybe some of these people didn't have to travel very far. These are the things that we just don't know. There's a lot of questions, and maybe we'll never have the answer. You're really limited by the data that comes out of the ground, and it isn't always complete data. It's often just a sample. Jill?
I have a question about DNA. Are any of these bone fragments, after they've been burned, can they take DNA samples off of them? Or is that also now forbidden because of the repatriation, whatever it's called?
Well, you would have to have some, I don't know if DNA comes out of burned bone.
I mean, they've done it with Neanderthal.
But I'm not sure those bones were burned, because those had different preservation conditions. So, and I'm amazed that they could get DNA from such ancient bones. But there was a woman from UMass Boston who was doing her doctorate on sea mammals. So Stephanie, she lives in Sudbury now actually, Stephanie got some bones, seal bones, from collections that were not burned. And there's a person, a specialist in Canada that extracts the DNA samples, but there was nothing left. And these bones are not that old. There was just nothing left in the bones. Okay, you haven't asked something.
I read in the history of Framingham and Wayland that Johnson Farm, which is near that area, abutted up against an Indian burial ground. And so I wondered if there was burial along the Sudbury River as well. Do you know of,
There may have been.
because didn't they like to bury in the slopes down to the water's edge, and they found that it was easier to dig there and bury?
I don't know, because one of the points Dena made about the Vincent Site in Sudbury, it was at the base of a hill and just no water anywhere nearby. And that was an isolated place because there was only one burial. Someone may have lived near there and died, and the family cremated them. Frank?
Tonya, can you draw any conclusions at all about housing on the studies that you've done? What type of housing?
No, not from the data in the burials, no. But the housing, we believe, were all what we call weetus, wigwams, or some kind of shelter where they took saplings and put them in the ground. The Robbins Museum has a wonderful diorama of an archaic village. And you can see, it was founded at a site called Wapanakit in southwestern Massachusetts on Assawamsett Pond. And that would give you a really good idea of what a village looked like if you could get down there to see it. We have a lovely diorama in the town building, and it does not show a village, but it gives an idea of how people in the woodland times would have lived anyway. It's very nicely done. If you haven't stopped to see that, you should have a look. Well, you and Dick.
I wondered if any burials you found remains from any burials where the people were not cremated, the bodies were not cremated,
We haven't in Wayland, no.
or anywhere around, I mean,
There are burials. Sometimes there are sites with shell middens, which is a shell heap where they threw the shells, and they buried people in those middens sometimes. And the good thing about that is the calcium carbonate in the shells leaches out from rainwater and such and raises the pH of everything, and so unburned bones would be preserved there. It doesn't work so much for plants, but it does for bones. Now, Dick, you were...
A factoid for more recently, about 2,000 years more recent, in South Natick, the Indian burial ground with the native praying Indians was based on native tradition. And the native tradition, which is borne out there and in other sites, was that the burial ground was not right by where the houses were. It was a place you went to with a quiet, peaceful view of water to the south. That's an interesting little piece of
The
right there in
southwest, usually, to the southwest. Way in the back.
Tonya, I thought maybe you could speak about where they may have wintered over where they built the highway. The cliff, the cave.
Where was that, Amanda? I'm not sure I'm hearing you.
Remember there's a site that was excavated where the highway was put in?
Oh, the Flag Swamp Rock Shelter? And what about it?
Well, I thought you could talk about that shelter.
No, I haven't mentioned that. That was in Marlborough. There were no burials there. But they did find what was interpreted as a winter habitation up against a rock, a cliff, a rock shelter. There were bones preserved there. And the archaeologists that did the CRM work, Cultural Resource Management surveys at that site, couldn't imagine why the bones were preserved. And the bedrock, they found out from the geologists that have to do with the road construction. said that there were bands of calcium carbonate that ran through the bedrock. And so that raised the pH, that leached out into the soil. There was what appeared to be a break, a shelter break, because beyond a certain number of feet there were no bones preserved and nothing that showed up. They didn't get anything. So there must have been some kind, maybe putting stakes leaning up against the rock shelter and covering it with mats, or some way to hold in the heat from fires between the break and the rock shelter. But there were a lot of things that were found there, a lot of fish bones and turtle bones, well preserved. I saw some of them when I was a student working in the lab at Harvard. Shirley.
Yeah, about the burials.
Mm-hmm.
Flags formed, there was a bear skull that looked like it had been buried deliberately.
Yes.
A sacred one. And back in Concord at the shell hidden, now just in the last year, I learned from a collection from that shell heap, which I hadn't seen these before, that there were some shell beads.
Oh.
And so when the Native American advisors from our current exhibit saw those, they said, oh, was probably a burial there. So we can't show that material. However, we don't know of any bones from that. But several Native American skeletons were found in Concord. Actually, interestingly, on the edge of Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. So as far as I know, they're still there, but they're in somebody's garden.
That does remind me that Hudson's History did mention that there was a skeleton that came out when they were building Route 20. But that was so long ago, and no one knows where the skeleton is.
Yeah,
Yeah. I know that several of you tried to find it to see what had happened to it. It was on display at the Sudbury Public Library for a while. Isn't that right, Royce? So anyway, we just don't know where some of those things are. Well, I don't know. I'll take one more question. I have no idea what time it is. I told Courtney we'd be not more than an hour.
3:36.
Okay.
Way in the back.
Where?
Put your hand up, there you go.
Okay. What's your question? Yes. Oh, Gina, I'm not hearing you.
She's asking about the area near the landfill, transfer station.
Oh, no, no bones turned up there. Just a few animal bones that were calcined, that were burned. But so much of it has been removed. The Mackin Sandbank in Greenfield, I worked on that project for a while. Institute for Conservation Archaeology did a project there. That had been, a lot of soil had been removed there, and Native people came and camped on the property because they thought that there were other burials. We found no evidence of any human burials there. So historically, I guess something had been there, but it was mined for years for sand and gravel. So sand and gravel banks are places where often there were burials. And if they're mined in recent times, you're going to lose everything. On Martha's Vineyard, on Lucy Vincent Beach, there was a burial ground up on the bluff. And with the erosion that goes on the Cape constantly, the Native people were starting to hear that skulls and such were rolling out onto the beach and people were finding them. So they asked Harvard to run a field school, and Elizabeth Chilton directed the field school. And they did all the excavations as far back from the edge that they thought was safe, so that more burials wouldn't go tumbling down the slope, and they were not cremated. Okay, well, thank you for your questions.